Hey, Kelsie.
Hey, Brooke.
Want to tell them what's happening in today's episode?
Brooke, today we're going to be talking about the Middle Passage, slave trade.
Oh, geez.
Moving people from Africa to the Americas.
Okay, we're here.
Yeah, settle in.
Get
it's
your
going to be
coffee.
rough.
Ooh. All right, let's do it.
Hello, and welcome to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%, the podcast that explores what happened to the women in history class. Now, here's your host, Kelsie Brooke Eckert, and her partner in crime, Brooke Neva Sullivan.
All right, Brooke. Today we're going to be talking about the Middle Passage, and this is a topic that is obviously kind of intersects U.S. history curriculum, world history curriculum. It's part of, teachers in school talk about triangle trade. Do you remember learning about that?
I actually do.
Yeah. So mercantilism is this idea that the colonies are responsible for feeding the mother country. And so, you extract the things from those colonies and send it back. And the mother country is responsible for providing, manufactured goods and whatever.
Yeah, trade.
And the effect of this is that, and especially in the American colonies where you have all this land that the Europeans perceive as untouched, even though there are hundreds of thousands of indigenous people living there. They need to bring in people, manual labor, to work that land, turn it into farmland for cash crops. And in U.S. history, we spent a lot of time talking about tobacco and cotton and whatever.
I was just going to say, tobacco.
Yeah.
Cotton.
Crushing it. Corn. Well, yeah. And so in my world history class, I spent a lot of time sort of de-Americanizing, de-US centralizing that and focusing more on things like sugar cane, which is coming out of the Caribbean and South America and
Coffee?
Yeah, right. And those are actually even scarier plantations to be sent to because it's hotter, more dangerous, more diseases, and the work is just brutal. And in the Spanish colonies, the treatment of these enslaved people is pretty horrible. And, I don't want to get into what's more horrible, but it's pretty bad.
Let's not do that.
In the Spanish colonies.
It's all horrible. You're enslaving humans. Let's just...
Yeah. Today we're going to talk about this topic, and I'm going to draw a lot from, the kind of normal books that people use to talk about this, like textbooks and things like that.
Okay.
But I'm also going to draw from two more recent publications. One's called Sexuality and Slavery, Reclaiming the Intimate Histories of the Americas. This was published in 2018. And another one is one that I think every teacher should have a copy of in their classroom. The first one that I just mentioned is a scholarly source. The chapters are, it's a collection of scholarly essays that people have written, and it's great. But the other one I think you should have a copy of. It's by Rebecca Hall. She's a historian, lawyer, and fellow at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. So she's, stupid. And I'm just kidding.
She's a real dum-dum.
Brilliant, obviously. And she turned, and you can tell that someone's brilliant, and they can take something that's complex and scholarly and break it down in a really approachable way for people.
Yeah.
And so she has published, obviously, because she's at Harvard, she has published lots of scholarly works. But she, in 2022, she published a book called Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts.
Interesting.
She published it as a graphic novel.
Whoa.
And it's awesome. It's the epitome of intelligence because you can take something complicated and explain it really simply to people. And so I think that every secondary educator should have a copy of this book in their classroom because I read it in an evening. It's not even though it's thick, it's not a complicated read because it's a graphic novel. And
wow, that's super relatable and approachable.
And it's also most history programs have a methods course that students take when they graduate. And her book is a methods lesson. It's like, how do we know what we know about women-led slave rebellions? And she like walks you through her research process. So
With images and pictures.
with images and pictures and diagrams and commentary, and it's awesome.
It's actually really interesting too to approach a topic that way and put images that are cartoon-esque
Yeah.
to that, because it's a really heavy topic.
Yeah.
And not that she's bringing levity per se, because I haven't
No.
seen the book, but at least pulling images that maybe there aren't a lot available for context. So you're taking something that would be very text heavy initially, and you're putting images to it that are really going to bring your students forward, which is ideal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. It's called Wake.
It's called Wake. Yep. And the subtitle is, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts.
And is it U.S. slave revolts?
So no, she focuses on, today we're going to talk about the Middle Passage. So she has some stuff about women in the Middle Passage, which is, the crossing the Atlantic, coming from Africa to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage. But she also has stuff on U.S. revolts. So there's one in New York and I'm making up a date, 1712, something like that happens.
Here come the trolls.
Yeah, I know. They're going to be like, this woman knows nothing. She's making up dates. But anyway, it's something like that. New York historians are like, please, we all know the date. Anyway.
There are a lot, actually. It's kind of annoying. And they're like, excuse me.
Anyway,
Get to my computer.
I'm making very clear
Fever
that
type.
that's a made-up date. But it's something like that. And anyway, so she does touch on U.S. history too. So I think it would be a great thing to include in a U.S. history text. But like I also teach modern world history, and I think it would be a great text to have, and you could use it there.
Sounds fascinating.
It's really, really good. So we're going to draw on those two sources, and I just highly recommend them to everybody. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is maybe a more like broader scholarship piece, just understanding how colonialism impacted gender dynamics. And essentially, it's not to say that Africa is not a monolith. It's not like one thing. It's not Africa. It was all these various kingdoms. And the ones that interacted in the early years of exploration were the ones on the west coast of Africa. And they were interacting primarily with Portuguese and Spanish explorers, but mostly Portuguese because of a rule that was passed by the Pope that basically gave the Spanish the Americas and the Portuguese Africa. And they divided the Atlantic Ocean. And this changed when they realized how big the Americas were. And the Pope was like, okay, just kidding. We'll give the Portuguese Brazil, so like they fudged the line a little bit later. But so you have all these Portuguese, and then later Dutch and English explorers, coming down west coast of Africa. And it's not to say that Africans hadn't been interacting for centuries, millennia with people through, what was called the sand roads, not the Silk Roads, the sand roads coming across the Sahara. And then, Islamic traders definitely down Eastern Africa and North Africa. But
the audience cannot see you right now of you making a lot of hand motions that
to describe
Africa. There's a map in front of us. So if you could envision a map in front of you, Kelsey is waving her arms across Africa.
Africa.
I'm like, yes, I'm sitting here understanding. Just had to tell the listener.
But there are parts, especially away from these coastal regions and away from East Africa, where, and I mean, you can think about Cleopatra, that's an African figure that a lot of people recognize in history. And she's a queen who led outright. There's Kandaki, who was from just south of where Cleopatra lived, and she also defended her empire against the Romans successfully, unlike Cleopatra. And so there's, those two women in ancient history are good examples of powerful African queens. And then all over African history are these oral histories and stories of really powerful queens. And it's not just anecdotally, there were African queens. It's enough that it's there are lots of African queens.
Oh yeah, this is very much a thing.
This is a thing. And so Africa is has lots of traditions in various kingdoms of matrilineal rule, where inheritance and different things are passed down through maternal lines. There's this long history of African queens. And then you see the impact of colonialism, where you take this very patriarchal Europe. You have predominantly, if not entirely, male explorers coming down the African coast. Mm-hmm. We see this in American history as Englishmen are interacting with indigenous people, and they want to talk to the man in charge, and this tribe, when the Dutch are interacting with the indigenous people in Manhattan, they say, we want to talk to the man in charge, and they send 3 girls to sign a treaty with the Dutch. And the Dutch are like, why? And they're like, because women are the backbone of our society, and these young women are going to be the future generation that leads us, so they should decide if they want to sign this treaty with you. Doesn't that just logically make sense? And the Dutch are like, cannot compute. We only work with men, And so the same is happening in parts of Africa, where these Portuguese explorers are we need to talk to the man in charge.
Yeah, who's the big guy?
Yeah. And it's not to say that I think people think that in a patriarchy, you've got men in charge, and in a matriarchy, it's just the opposite.
No.
And that's not what it is. What's your understanding of matriarchy?
Matriarchy to me is many women that are creating a community and fostering an environment that is more equitable versus one singular female in charge.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. It's more, it's a communal
so
leadership.
there's someone that helps with childbirth. There's someone that helps with food and sustenance. There's another, and they're all it's more of a committee.
Yeah. And
which is kind of funny of how a lot of women socialize and convene and lead.
Yeah.
It's communal.
Sharing.
Yeah.
What is interesting in some of the first book that I mentioned, Sexuality and Slavery, one of the things they talk a lot about is these early interactions between Portuguese explorers or English explorers or French explorers and African people, and how it's hard to even trace back the beginning of this. Mm-hmm. But what we know is that eventually these coastal areas become really patriarchal, if they weren't already like that. And it's the effect of these trading relationships. It's the way that in these matriarchal societies, roles were distinguished, where women may be in charge, but men are the ones that are still soldiers. They're still, and that's not always true. The Dahomey Amazon are a really good example of that. So, but colonialism and these interactions with patriarchal Europe are shifting gender dynamics in Africa and in the Americas.
Because those people are coming in and saying, I need to talk to a guy.
Yeah.
And that's not being true. And so they're missing out on opportunity because they don't have that established role.
Correct. And so they might be, yeah. And so over time, this changes societies within Africa. And it's also really interesting because, are you familiar with the term cognitive dissonance? This is a psych concept.
No, say more.
So cognitive dissonance is where you basically you're playing cognitive tricks on yourself to justify your own behaviors.
Oh, okay. I got you.
So we see that in the writings of these male explorers who are interacting with African women who are so distinctly different than European women. And initially in and this isn't always true, you could take a variety of different sources and you could see the way their the amount of time that they're hanging out with African people changes what they're saying about these African people. And I would say in general, there's a degree of admiration, if not kind of making different these different women, maybe like an erotic thing, you know, like,
Oh.
So that's kind of gross for sure.
Yeah, like sexualizing them.
But because there's a bit of admiration behind it. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is they start writing about how, these African women are really strong and they're really powerful. And it's so in contrast to European women who are sickly and weak and like, you know, like die in childbirth so frequently, whereas these African women are like healthier and like give birth, you know, more successfully and seem to do it without pain, which there's, you know, that's
oppressed women and free women.
right. What a concept.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's, I bet it's really interesting to look at their, and how they value them as peers versus subordinates.
Yeah. Like one guy in 1602, he was a French explorer, Pieter de Marais, announced in 1602, the women here are of a cruder nature and stronger posture than females in our land in Europe. And this was like a weird sentence, and the authors wrote about how this is like a backhanded compliment, where they're basically like saying that they are strong and more capable. But then it's also, you can see these like early origins of really racist beliefs and concepts that because these women are cruder and stronger, they are therefore capable of more physical labor, aka slavery. They are capable of enduring pain. You know, like, oh, they don't feel pain the same way that white women do.
God, that perpetuates for centuries.
Centuries, yeah. So, so anyway, this is just, I think these early sources can give us a sense of these myths and the way that you have, and most of the sources from this period that they use in this book, and I think largely because these are the sources that are available for us to understand African women, they're white European male sources describing these women.
So the lens.
Yeah, you have to like put this lens of, you know, distance and understanding that there's no way these men really understood what these women are going through. One of the other things that we know is that in these early years, like 1400, you know, 1450s forward, Portuguese, French, Dutch, English explorers that are interacting with these African women are also interacting with them because these women, in a lot of cases, there was a robust sexual slavery in the west coast of Africa. And so a lot of these women were enslaved. Now, what that looked like is really different than the slavery we envision in U.S. history, which has no expiration date. It's a lifelong, you know, status, and you know, your owner had rights to kill you, to beat you, to, you know, all these other things. So it definitely had different roles and functions, but a lot of these women were wrapped up in sexual slavery, and they were often prostituted out to European travelers as like, you know, like, welcome to our land. We're so excited to work with you. Also, like, there's this whorehouse down the street, like, you know, enjoy yourself while you're here. Some of these Europeans like took African wives, and it's kind of interesting because they didn't see them as like wives per se, because often they had wives back home, but they like had these women that were like their sexual partners while they were away from Europe and whatever. We know that slavery is there, and we know that these sexual dynamics are in place even before, you know, these people are captured, you know, sold, put on ships, and taken to the Americas.
Right.
One of the interesting things is that for enslaved people, these early days of being captured, and you know, this is really tricky because you've got Europeans literally seizing people, taking them, putting them on ships.
It's terrifying.
You also have, you know, long-standing rivalries between African peoples and kingdoms, and they're conquering each other and selling each other into perpetual slavery, in order often to position. And I don't want to make it sound like, well, Africans are betraying each other and doing this. It's like, no, they're put in a position because of colonialism and European power where it's sort of like, you are these other guys, so what's your choice? You know?
Exactly.
So that's awful. But they're often held in a coastal town, and then when the ship arrives, they're put on the ship and sent off. We have diagrams. I think these diagrams are really persuasive sources to show students.
These are something that I can vividly remember learning in class, and they were terrifying. What grade are we introducing this now?
I mean, I think it should be introduced early. Like,
it was like 6th grade from what if my brain is accurate.
Yeah. I mean, U.S. history in New Hampshire is supposed to be taught by 8th grade. Like, you should have had a U.S. history course. That varies state to state, and it definitely varies internationally. So if we have people in Europe listening, or Australia, it might be a little bit different, but I think most people by the end of middle school, by 14.
I mean, we covered World War II in 7th grade, and we covered Vietnam by 8th grade. So I think we did colonialism and slave trade and all that in 5th and 6th.
How vivid you make this, could vary. I think if you're teaching younger students, just showing them these diagrams and showing them how packed in, and anybody who's been on an international flight knows it's really freaking uncomfortable to be packed in on a plane.
Cruise ships.
Right. Now imagine take that space that you have on the plane and the luxury to get up and move, and then amplify that by 1,000,000, knowing that there's no opportunity to get up and move. You're chained to the floor.
There's no food. There's no water.
Yeah. Well, there's food and water, but it's garbage and minimal, and
there's disease.
And you're
sitting in your own feces. Women who are pregnant are giving birth in these conditions. Gosh.
And the baby's not surviving.
What is always stark to me is the number that get on and the number that get off.
Yeah.
And how drastically different those numbers are.
Yeah.
So how many people are dying through this voyage and then through the sea and are taken off the ships? It's and I guess in this time period, travel by sea is dangerous no matter what. It is likely that people will die at sea in good condition.
Yeah. Right.
But in this condition, it's astronomical.
Right. I mean, this document, the one that I think a lot of people show in their class, this was the stowage of the slave ship. It was a regulated slave act of 1788, and this was supposed to be the improved conditions. And so you can assume that prior to 1788,
they were terrible.
They were even worse than this because they weren't.
And they even figured out if we ship people like this, they're not going to survive as well. So let's fix this a little bit.
We need a little bit better return on investment here. So that was sarcasm, to be clear. Okay, thank you. And this is a British source because it's all in English, but I can
remember. I don't know if you did this field trip. You grew up in New England too, but in Mystic, Connecticut, close to where I grew up, there's all the old ships. You go to see the tall ships.
Yeah,
and there is one that they have in the harbor that was part of the slave trade, and they do have the low. It's called the bottom of the boat, not the hull. I forgot what it's called, but there's where the seamen, the workers would live, and then there's the storage below, and that's where they held slaves.
Yeah.
And you walk down there as a student, it is horrifying. It is just wait, people fit down here and they stayed down here for weeks and weeks and weeks.
I'm a sailor, and I've spent a lot of time on boats. I get so sick sometimes on there. I can't imagine. One of the cures for seasickness is
seeing
looking
land.
Looking at the horizon and just having a point to center yourself. I can't imagine being down below deck, unable to see out, vomit out, breathe fresh air, all the things that would help you just deal with normal seasickness, let alone the horrors of being packed in, often next to people that you don't necessarily know. Unable
who've never been on ships before either. This, it's just
unable to support each other.
Anyways,
bringing it to positive things.
How do you do that?
Not positive, I guess, but more resilient, optimistic things. One of the things that's really interesting is slave rebellions on these ships are more likely to happen while they were still in sight of land, because it was if we can
see, we can get home.
Yeah, we can get home. And often people on the coast would come out and help. Like they would like get in little like dinghies or whatever and like try to overthrow the ship before they could get away. That's kind of interesting. Is like for the slavers, the most dangerous part is like while you're still near Africa. But then the other thing is just the sheer number of slave rebellions that occurred during the Middle Passage, I think is overwhelming, because people think like, oh, these poor victims who were put on the ship, they couldn't do anything and they, you know, whatever. And it's like, no, they were resisting actively from jump, you know, from go. And I think that's a really important piece of history, because it's counter to the Christian narrative that Europeans are doing this thing to support, to like bring these heathens to the light, you know, and like we're giving them Christianity by converting them. We're giving them training in jobs and whatever that will better them and make them less backward or whatever. And all of that is obviously nonsense. It's cognitive dissonance, right? Trying to justify this ill treatment and dehumanizing of these people. So on the theme of dehumanizing, coming back to negative things, is this entire process was designed to strip these people of their humanity by packing them in like animals down below deck. The other thing that's really interesting, though, is we have this history, these sources that show us that European men do sexualize these women that they see as exotic. They also now are in positions of power where consent is non-existent. So one of the interesting things is we know from quantitative studies that the more women that were on board these ships, and this comes from Rebecca Hall's graphic novel that I talked about before, but also like lots of scholarship that she's published, the more women that were on board these these ships, the more likely a rebellion was to happen. And she talks about how historians who stumbled upon this data, this quantitative analysis of slave ships, were mostly male who were doing this initial research, and they sort of dismissed that as a weird fluke of history. And she's coming back to this evidence and saying, no, it's not a weird fluke of history. This is like obvious, right? And one of the reasons is because of the sexual exploitation of these women, especially young, pretty women, were not down below. They were actually up above deck. Being sexually exploited by these European men. And one of the plus sides of that is they were more free. They weren't bound and held, and they were in proximity to weapons. And so these women, who, like every other slave getting on these ships, were going to resist, even if resistance was futile, right? They've heard enough stories. And one of the, even if you are successful in liberating the men from below decks, like you're still probably going to die, right? Like you might, the ship might go down, like there's a high likelihood of death, but people resisted anyway. And that's really interesting and important. So these women had better access to weapons. They would start the rebellion. They would arm their, the people down below decks. And so when women were on board these ships, the more women on board the ships, the more likely a rebellion was to happen. Now, I think this is a great example of like women getting erased in history, right? And their sexual exploitation being erased in history. I don't necessarily think that's something to bring up with middle schoolers, but definitely high school. Right? Definitely that should be talked about. I think, this gets back to something we've talked about a lot, that like when sex and sexuality are involved in the history, that often leads to women's erasure. But like, because teachers are too scared to talk about those topics in class.
Well, it's tough. Those are tough. I mean, I'm telling you how vividly I remember seeing the images of the boats. It sticks with you at a young age when you have not been exposed to those things.
Yeah.
It should.
Yeah.
It should stick with you.
It should stick with you.
These are the points of teaching tough history.
Right. Right.
Learn from it. Don't repeat it, and be sensitive to it.
So how does she's not just taking this quantitative evidence and like hoping for the best here. Like, this isn't just a theory. In 1789, the Privy Council has this document where they say, the slave, if a man, is put in iron on the main deck. If a boy, he's put on the main deck loose. If a woman or girl, they are placed without irons on the quarter deck. This was policy on board the ships. So certainly these women, part of that is sexism in action and not working in favor actually of them. It's actually sexism proving them to be idiots. Like, oh yeah, just leave the women without irons on the deck. That sounds like a good plan, and why are they doing that? They're assuming that these women, if they did anything, they could put them down really quickly. They are assuming women are too docile and weak and whatever to do that, even though they know that they're not, because they write about their strength. So, but she says, we know from other source material that rape and sexual violence are present on these ships.
Yep.
And so, but women are active in these rebellions, and I think that's really empowering. I also think that this speaks to what I said before, how this entire experience of the Middle Passage is designed to dehumanize. I also think it's designed to emasculate, and I think that's a piece that we should talk about too. I think historic imagination is a really good thing to bring into your classes. And I try to imagine being one of these African males shackled below deck, listening to what's happening up above deck.
And if your wife or sister or daughter is up there.
Or just a woman who looks like you. Do you know what I'm saying? And how that is intentionally designed to make these men feel helpless to help their women. Do you know what I'm saying? I think that's a really important piece of this. And how that also for men would be a motivator to rebel too. So I don't think this is entirely just about women being in positions to rebel, right? Like by being unshackled above deck. Mm-hmm. I also think this is about motivation. And these women are more motivated perhaps than men to rebel because of what's actively the violence that's actively happening to them. But I also think it's motivating for African men to do something to stop the violence against their women. I think the combination of those things are why when more women are on these ships, rebellion is more likely. The sheer number of rebellions that happen, I think, is just really important to appreciate. And like I said, most of these are unlikely to succeed. Millions, but the number of rebellions cost slavers millions of dollars in annual revenue, which is what? Wouldn't they want to puzzle through why these rebellions are happening and figure that out? And the nice thing is that it prevents so many people from going into perpetual slavery in the Americas. And then, the likelihood of it would be rare if you made it to one of those sugar colonies. It would be rare if you made it past the age 30 because of the conditions in which you were working.
What was the average age, let's say, if you were not a slave?
40s or 50s.
Enslaved person.
Yeah. 40s or 50s would probably be that in that time period. There's a cool account in Sexuality and Slavery of this older woman who worked in the sugar colonies who survived into her 30s, maybe even 40s. But she had children who survived infancy, but they both she outlived both of her children, which is really hard. But her children's lives were more typical than hers were, which made her kind of an interesting anomaly where she became this old woman on the plantation. And, that's horrible. The conditions in which these people lived in the Americas were horrible. To me, this is such important. It's important to gender the story of the Middle Passage, because when you bring gender in, it illuminates a piece of this story and it explains these rebellions, I think, so much better, which is why Hall's work and Barry, who edited the Sexuality and Slavery text, like, this is so important. And to me, it tells a much more whole story of this awful experience that these enslaved people endured while crossing the Atlantic.
Yeah, and it breaks assumptions. I think a lot of times, like, students can just lean into, oh, mostly men were captured and brought over, and that's not true.
Yeah.
And so I think it's also highlighting those assumptions and those falsities and making sure that you're still telling a really accurate narrative.
And that cognitive dissonance in play, like, they basically, while they had these beliefs about women that they, were maybe weaker or whatever, that didn't apply to African women. Like, African women were worked in the fields and on, developing sugarcane just the same as their male counterparts. And they were given like barely a minute after they gave birth, to like go back. And I think that just speaks to the way that their gendered assumptions about women varied by race. And those things impacted us, like you said, for centuries. Those racist ideas about the pain that Black women were able to endure persisted, and those things impact Black women right now when they go to doctors, right? Because
100%.
Those ideas are still there, and their complaints are less validated by often white male doctors in those positions. And I think these things, these come back to, you can trace these ideas back to some of the earliest texts European texts that we have about African women.
Kelsie, thank you. This was heavy. Yes. I'm going to walk into my day a little heavier, but also really informed. And I'm excited about these texts that you're bringing forward. So I appreciate it. So thanks, Kelsie.
Thanks, Brooke.
See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening to Remedial Herstory, the other 50%. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts to bring more voices to the conversation. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time.